All right, man, peace. So, brothers, almost as if on cue, there's been a new wrinkle added into the Kwame Brown storyline. Not that it needs any flavoring or any spice, but, you know, where there's smoke, there's going to be fire, and wherever there's fire, people are going to gather around. Jemele Hill has made a name for herself, particularly over the last 5 years or so, by being able to confound many of the lower level thinking so-called black men within the wokosphere. Like, they actually believe that this person, Jemele Hill, is on the level and is someone to listen to. Like I always tell you, brothers, she's a liberal woman, and the liberal black woman has three altars, that being the racialist, the globalist, the feminist. Their real intention is always to promote feminism and then second globalism, but they have to lead with the racialism. Why is that? Because the man is the generator of real energy. From the man comes society, from the man comes civilization, from the man comes order. So the powers that be, operating under the energy of the serpent on the left-hand side, always work through the woman to try to subdue and subvert the man. That's where the so-called black woman comes in, or really the liberal so-called black woman, because there are sisters who are on point, relatively on point. They're just very few and far between. Jemele Hill's name is always going to be mentioned whenever many of these storylines start to get propagated, because they want her to be perceived as a gatekeeper. What's a gatekeeper? A gatekeeper is basically an entity who reports to both sides. In this case, the so-called ruling class Caucasians, but also interfaces with their own people, their own kind. In the ancient world, they were known as proxy rulers or proxy governors, like puppets. That's what the modern day boule is. This is where Jemele Hill comes in. And that's the only reason why you see her so much on CNN and MSNBC, and she writes for the Huffington Post. These are just facade organizations that are meant to promote Caucasian liberalism, which is nothing but Luciferianism. And that's why this storyline is so interesting, and that's why it's grabbed at the minds and tugged at the heartstrings of so many so-called black men out here, and other people as well. Once again, the most valuable commodity on the planet Earth in this three-dimensional realm is the truth. It's not gold, it's not silver, it's not diamonds, it's not water, it's not land, it's the truth. And that's why, number one, when you have the intelligence to comprehend the truth, and number two, the courage to speak the truth, and number three, the eloquence to speak it well, the people will gather around you. That's how it's always been. That's how it's always going to be. Kwame Brown, he appears to be very gifted in his ability to perceive the truth and also his courage to speak it. He's very quick-witted, and no matter what people say, whether it's a so-called Caucasian and even a so-called black woman, people are mesmerized by a so-called black man who can see through the bullshit, who can see through the facade. Because no matter what they say, they do not respect the intellect. And if they don't respect the intellect, they don't respect the existence of the so-called black man. The so-called black man is the proverbial dog of the house. You're treated well when you act well. The family appears to love you, but you're only going to get the scraps. They'll let you in the house when it pleases them. When you displease them, they will kick you out of the house, and they will expect you to protect the house. Once again, the so-called black man is the proverbial dog of this society. The so-called black woman is the proverbial maid of this society. That's why she believes that she's better than the man, because the maid, at least, is allowed to stay in the house. The dog can be kicked out every once in a while, once they get tired of you. And that's why, for the most part, they only want the so-called black man to be a security guard, because just like a dog, you must guard the house, meaning the society, and be thankful. But just getting back to the point, as we've seen over these last few days, brothers who pay attention and have a three-dimensional frame of thought, you should understand by now that this is a great case study for the dynamics that pervade not only, this so-called Western civilization that we're captive in, but also the world and how we're perceived. Look at a lot of the chicanery and the machinations that are being utilized against Kwame Brown that he's already well aware of. See, when you pay attention, you can call out what your opponent's going to do. You know how they speak about great football players, like a great middle linebacker, such as Ray Lewis or Mike Singletary. They can call out what the play is going to be Not even based on what the quarterback is saying, but just how he's standing, right? A LeBron James, a Rajon Rondo, they can tell you what the opponent is running just by the personnel on the floor. It's the same thing with the so-called black man who has, as Kwame Brown calls it, his third eye open. That's a proverb, of course, not literal. But proverbially speaking, the third eye, meaning you can see things three-dimensionally. You know what everybody's going to do. You know what the woman's going to do. You know what the so-called Caucasian man's going to do. You know what the structures of this society, you know how they're going to react to you. It's almost like they drill these things so that when a situation arises, they know how to set things in motion. So Kwame knew that they were going to try to use certain shaming tactics, and that's where Charlemagne comes in. I may be covering him in another video in regards to what he has to do with this storyline on my other channel. This is really just for a Morningside chat, or at least in this case, an afternoon chat. Because Jemele Hill did something that many liberal so-called black females do. They try to force themselves into narratives involving the so-called black man. And I told you brothers this before. The reason why they do it is because deep down, the so-called black woman knows that people don't really want to hear what the fuck she's talking about. That's the reason why they talk about race so much. Because outside of talking about race, for the most part, the average conversation of the woman is folly and nonsense. And they know it. When they're not talking about race, what are they talking about? Normally, how much they hate their job, or a reality TV show, or how much they like some guy, or how much they hate some guy. What really of substance are they speaking about? Especially in this day and age when most of them are not married, they're not with a man. Many of them don't even understand how to raise their children properly. Of course, that's not every and all women, but the vast majority of them, they're not speaking about anything. Because once again, they've rejected their head, that being the man. In the same way, the so-called black man, his conversation is low level in general because he's rejected his head, that being the Most High, right? So that's the issue here. Jemele Hill, she tried to force herself into this storyline in a haphazard way, and she didn't think that Kwame would call her out on it because Jemele Hill thinks that every so-called black man believes that she's for so-called black people. Well, when you have your quote-unquote third eye open, you understand what Jemele Hill actually is. That being a triple agent, working for fake racialism, for globalism, and for feminism. And feminism and globalism are counterproductive to what the so-called black man needs, and Kwame Brown understands that. But we're going to see, especially over how the interactions between Jemele Hill and Kwame Brown transpired, that she was trying to cryptically use certain tactics that had a white woman use them, she would have been called a Karen. Even if she would have tried to claim that she was quote-unquote just joking, as Jemele Hill will allege. But also pay very close attention to how the media tries to frame the dichotomy between Kwame Brown and Jemele Hill. So this was an article that I found on this website, Bro Bible, which by the name of the website, one might assume is supposedly a website geared towards men, allegedly. But on this website called Bro Bible, it's an article written by someone named Jorge Alonso. The title says, Kwame Brown comes after Jemele Hill even after she pleaded with him to leave her alone. Now look at how the title of this article is structured. Obviously, they're trying to put forth the connotation that Kwame Brown is some type of predator, sexually, or has some misogynistic undertones. It says he comes after Jemele Hill even after she pleaded with him to leave her alone. That's something that you might think you'd listen to on a podcast that's detailing how a woman was kidnapped and raped, right? So why would they frame the article like this without framing it appropriately when it comes to why Kwame Brown even spoke to her in the first place? And that's why Kwame said what he said about Jemele Hill and the interjection of women in general. Don't speak when two men are speaking. Because no matter what you're learning in college or at your university, you're never going to speak on the level of two men who have their quote-unquote third eye open or who comprehend what's going on around them. I don't care how much education you've received. Now, you build up to a higher level of understanding when you have formed an allegiance with your man, with your husband, and he has that three-dimensional comprehension. But you just trying to have general conversations with men and trying to force yourself into these various storylines, it's nothing but bullshit, and it's attention mongering. It says here, Jemele Hill pleads with Kwame Brown not to come after her following his wild rants directed at Stephen A. Smith, Matt Barnes, and Stephen Jackson. It's extremely irresponsible and almost unbelievable how this article is structured. But as Kwame Brown already noted, this is how they attack the image of the so-called black man. Once again, this is 2021. This is how articles were written back in the 1900s, the early 1900s, when they were trying to imply that the so-called black man was this ape creature who wanted to have sex with every white woman, right? So the reason why they can now use these same tactics pertaining to a so-called black man who's having an issue with a so-called black woman, they're trying to tell you cryptically that now the so-called black woman is on our side now, nigga. She's not on your side. She only interacts with you for procreation purposes. That's it. Other than that, mentally, spiritually, culturally, we have her. So now we're going to protect her like we do the so-called white woman. And we're only going to put her out there to hold your hand and work with you while we're trying to promote liberalism, aka Luciferianism, in your community. That's why these niggas, in order for them to be in long-term relationships, they have to become Marxists. They have to accept that it's okay for their child to be LGBTQ at 3 years old and get sex changes at 1 year old. Because many modern day so-called black females believe that shit. Liberal black women. They believe that. So that's the point of how this article is being framed. They're trying to help the so-called black man understand that in their view, they have the so-called black woman in their clutches, hook, line, and sinker. And for the most part, it's true. But reading on, it says, Brown doesn't listen and comes after her anyways. Yeah, he's like Jason Voorhees. He just keeps coming with his hockey mask and his butcher knife. At the bottom, it says Kwame Brown is on a rampage and has people in the media terrified of his rants. Oh, boy. Once again, look at how they're trying to depict this cat Kwame Brown, using the same literary tactics as in the early 1900s. It says in the past week, Brown went off on Stephen Jackson, Matt Barnes, and Gilbert Arenas with vicious rants for talking bad about him. Just yesterday, Brown challenged ESPN's Stephen A. Smith to mutual combat for constantly making jokes about his career over the years. Well, really, what Kwame was trying to convey is that Stephen A. Smith is someone who likes to get on television and talk real tough and act like he's not scared of anyone. And as he himself, when I say he himself, I'm talking about Kwame, as Kwame stated explicitly in reference to Stephen A. Smith has sat on television and basically challenged and called out Kevin Durant numerous times, trying to imply that he would whoop Kevin Durant's ass. In other words, KD, if you're upset by what I'm saying, do something about it. But that's how they treat and speak to the property in these major sports leagues, because they know that they're compromised. There's only so much that a KD can say to a Stephen A. Smith, because KD understands the role of prominence that Stephen A. Smith has in the sports media world. He's another quote-unquote gatekeeper. Not on the same wavelength of a Jemele Hill, but he's also a gatekeeper. Whenever he speaks about race, he always makes a fucking fool of himself because he doesn't understand what he's speaking about. Stephen A. Smith is ignorant. He's a two-dimensional thinker. He's an intelligent brother for a two-dimensional thinker, but if you try to speak to him on a three-dimensional wavelength, he's not going to get it. Same thing with Jemele Hill. She's never going to get it, but she's a woman anyway. Women in general, 99.999% of them, they're two-dimensional thinkers. Are there sisters out there who are exceptions to that? Of course. But we have to understand the woman is a reflection of the man. So one of the main reasons why the woman has such a difficult time comprehending on a three-dimensional level is because most of these niggas are dimwits. They're not presiding over the household. They're not giving the woman examples of men who can teach them things and who actually have standards. Are we perfect? Absolutely not. We all have shortcomings, but at the end of the day, if we had a code that we adhere to, then the woman would have respect for how she's supposed to be thinking, but because she knows she can jump from man to man and hear different standards with every man, what that implies to her is that it's okay for her to embrace being capricious. Because even the men are capricious, or the males, I should say, are capricious. But let me just read this again. It says, in the past week, Brown went off on Steven Jackson, Matt Barnes, and Gilbert Arenas with vicious rants for talking bad about him. Just yesterday, Brown challenged ESPN's Stephen A. Smith to mutual combat for constantly making jokes about his career over the years. He really didn't necessarily challenge Stephen A. Smith. He just basically called him out for all of his trash talk over the years and said, look, if you're really about that, meet me in Seattle. And, Kwame has a future in wrestling if that's what he wants to do. Now they're quoting Kwame, or at least allegedly this is a quote. It's possible that they may have omitted certain words just based on the tonality of this article thus far. I wouldn't put it past the writer here. It says, a 17, 18-year-old kid, and you walk around like you're a big tough man. You were going to college campuses speaking on teenage kids, and your only talent is knowing a bunch of big words and talking disrespectful to the children. Stephen A., you bald forehead motherfucker. I don't know why you got people thinking you're tough, saying all kinds of shit, saying you can come see me, meet me in Seattle where we can have mutual combat and talk like that. It's going to look like you got a toupee in the front of your head by how hard I'd slap you. Basically, that's Kwame Brown, and everyone's trying to cast him as this super angry person. Brothers, as human beings, we're basically just flesh and bones covering pure energy. So that means that we receive pure energy from people and we emit pure energy towards people. So of course, that means that whatever energy we receive from someone is what we're going to reflect back at them. It doesn't make you angry or bitter because someone is treating you a certain way and you reflect that energy back onto them. Even if you take the high road, right? Even if you take the high road, there's going to be a certain level or a certain wavelength of energy that you project back at a person who is wantonly negative to you. Because many times taking the high road could mean what? Just ignoring or disregarding that person. But Kwame Brown is not, I haven't seen anything from him that tells me that he's out of control as a person or that he is particularly bitter or angry. In order to find that out, I would have to speak to his wife or whoever his lady friends are, as well as his children, because those are the people who matter. And that's why if you pay very close attention, Steven Jackson and Matt Barnes, they're always trying to restrict the conversation to basketball because those niggas are still stuck in their basketball life. Like they think that they're still 25 years old. Kwame Brown is younger than the both of them, but he has matured beyond them when it comes to his understanding about life. He owns his own property, owns his own land, runs his own businesses. Matt Barnes and Steven Jackson are whores for the corporations. Therefore, they're never going to speak real. They're marketed as people who speak real. They're both liberals. Liberals don't speak real. They just regurgitate what they're told. If Steven Jackson or Matt Barnes ever truly felt like Donald Trump would be a better president or would have made a better president than Joe Biden, they would have lost their job at All the Smoke associated with Showtime, which I believe is a subsidiary of CBS. And we know how CBS was pumping for Joe Biden. So that's how it goes, bro. You could tell independent men and men who actually have a ruling class mentality, people like Floyd Mayweather and this cat Kwame Brown, it doesn't mean that they should be quote unquote trusted per se. It just means that you have to understand what wavelength they're communicating with you on. It says here, Jamel Hill saw how Brown was coming for everyone and pleaded with him to leave her alone by joking that he chose violence during his rants against Matt Barnes. Well, no, that's not quite what happened. It wasn't that Jamel Hill necessarily saw how Brown was coming for everyone. It was that, Jamel Hill's one of these bros who's pushing 50 but still thinks that she's 22. So she gets caught up in the memes and the internet challenges and the social media waves. She wants to ride these waves. So she felt compelled to stick her head into a crowd of people talking, and their conversation didn't concern her. As usual, because she's looking for attention. Once again, this is why the so-called black woman likes talking about race, because she knows that the target of most of these racial issues is the so-called black man. And she sees how much the media talks about race. So if she wants attention, she must talk about race. That's why her buddy Kerry Champion, Jamel Hill's buddy Kerry Champion, is jumping on the race wave. That's why Oprah Winfrey all of a sudden started talking about race again, after neglecting it for 20, 25 years. Because it's what's hot in the streets. Now this right here is Jamel Hill's Twitter. It says, Kwame Brown got me checking the tape to make sure I ain't ever said shit about him. If I did, I'm sorry. Please don't talk about my mama. This was an attempt by Jamel Hill to be funny. And someone needs to tell her that she's not funny. Every time she tries to make jokes, it just comes off as someone who is not particularly witty or even insightful or intelligent, because humor tends to be an offshoot of intellect. It takes timing. It takes an astute grasp of the truth, because the truth makes for the best jokes, right? You don't make a fat joke about a skinny person. You make a fat joke about someone who's hefty. You just have to be able to say it in a way that's clever or cunning enough that people see that they should laugh about it, as opposed to it being a cruel jibe at someone. But Jamel doesn't get it. You know, this is the same person who was interviewing what's this cat's name? Jake Paul, the boxer, after he knocked out, what's the little cat named Nate Robinson? And she started talking about if she gonna ask Jake Paul a question about whether or not he thought it was racist that he knocked out a black guy. Now, on what planet is that funny? She thought it was funny because she started doing her damn pork chop eating laugh to that stupid shit. Her and her idiot friend Kerry Champion, they thought the shit was funny. At least supposedly they did. Jake Paul didn't laugh, and I don't think that anyone who watched the show laughed because it wasn't funny. Do you think that it was racist that you knocked out a black guy? Especially, supposedly, in the racial climate that we're in, why would you ask him a question like that? It was just dumb. And that's how you know this person, Jamel Hill, she doesn't have an ability to really sense the temperature of the room. So there has to be a reason why she keeps popping up everywhere, and so-called black people in America at large are being made to believe that she's someone that people should listen to. Now, this was another tweet from her because obviously, you know, maybe the first one didn't get enough attention. She said, Kwame Brown today and yesterday, and there was like an option button here, and it's activated, meaning that he, quote unquote, chose violence or activated violence, which is a slogan that these little internet niggas like to use. And she claims that it's a quote from Game of Thrones. Well, you know, everybody didn't watch Game of Thrones. I didn't. So I wouldn't know what that meant, especially if you're a so-called black man like a Kwame Brown who alleges that he's fighting for the perception of so-called black men, knowing how the mainstream media presents so-called black men as being wantonly violent. We've seen it over the course of this article thus far, how the scribe has chosen to depict Kwame Brown. Of course, he'll claim that that's not the case because, you know, this is an instance of Kwame Brown as a so-called black man going against other black people. But there is a difference between the quote-unquote good black, or the archetype of the black man and woman that the mainstream media and the other races want you to be, as opposed to the bad black who they don't want you to be. And that's where the disparity in depictions come in this modern day time. Now, back in the early 1900s, it would have been every black man is like a predator. But now in 2021, it's, well, the independent thinking black man, we have to demonize him. So we'll use the same tactics as 100 years ago. Except the difference is now we can recruit the liberal blacks on our side to help us in demonizing the three-dimensional thinking so-called black man. That's where the confusion comes in. And that's why there needs to be a splintering in these thought processes, especially in this day and time where the so-called black man has so many outlets to express himself. There's no need for, you know, for this nonsensical assertion that everybody has to come together. Kwame Brown mentioned it himself with this agenda of inclusiveness or inclusivity. Nothing of value is all inclusive, right? Other than maybe a vacation. It states here, Brown misinterpreted Hill's comments. Did he? Did he really misinterpret, or did he pick up the coded language? Did he pick up the implication? Did he pick up the inference disguised as humor? It says here, Brown misinterpreted Hill's comments and believed she was saying he was violent, which he took offense to. Which is what he's supposed to take offense to. Right now, in Kwame Brown's mind, he's fighting for his life, ideologically. In his view, he's fighting for the self-respect of so-called black men. So it's like any other situation where someone tells a joke out of turn or out of season. So now Jemele Hill, she realizes that she's in hot water because the Kwame Brown hive is getting stronger and stronger every day. So obviously they were hitting her up in her DMs or her private messages or whatever you call the mechanism that these various social media outlets use for people to communicate privately. She says to Kwame Brown, I said you chose violence. Well, no, you really didn't say that. You put up some little graphic that I guess was meant to imply to him that he quote unquote chose violence. But what you assumed was that he was familiar with a lot of these social media catchphrases. And Kwame Brown, as someone who obviously runs businesses, he's not on social media all fucking day. At least not until the last 3 days. The brother has a tractor. He has properties and shit like that. Like, he's a country boy. He's not on fucking IG and Twitter reading memes and seeing what niggas are talking about. I mean, for the most part, this stuff is used to dumb people down. So, she's assuming that he knows what that stupid ass term means, and he didn't. So she says to Kwame Brown, I said you chose violence. That's a lie. You didn't say anything. You just put up a graphic. It's an expression from Game of Thrones. Well, I have news for you, Miss Hill. A lot of people didn't watch that show. A lot of people did, but a lot of people also didn't. She says, I didn't call you violent. Well, actually, yes, you did. Your graphic did. It was an on switch for violent. And you had Kwame Brown up there. But once again, this is how they speak. They speak cryptically. It's just that he caught her. She says, please and thank you. No, please and thank you. You've already injected yourself into this situation, so now you have to deal with the repercussions.